Now, we can't go much further in Women's History Month without remembering our first and so far only female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. Born in Wales in 1961, Gillard emigrated to Adelaide with her family in 1966. She became interested in the union movement as a university student and in 1983 became the second woman to lead the Australian Union of Students. She transferred to the University of Melbourne and graduated with a law degree in 1986. By the age of 29, Gillard had become the youngest partner ever at Slater and Gordon, specialising in industrial law. A member of the Australian Labor Party, Gillard entered politics full-time in 1996, and within 2 years she had won the House of Representatives seat of Laylaw in Victoria's West and become a full-time politician. Julia Gillard usually sat to the left of the Labor Party's policy agenda. This was reflected in her roles in opposition, in immigration, reconciliation and Aboriginal affairs, health and business. She had cross-party support for a tilt at the leadership and became deputy leader in 2007. Then came the infamous night of 23rd of June 2010. That's when she forced a leadership spill and ousted the sitting Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. Now, it wasn't pretty, but it did mean that Australia had its first female Prime Minister sworn in by its first female Governor-General, Quentin Bryce. As PM, Gillard faced harsh sexist criticism from the kind of men who now have sexual assault allegations against them. She never gained much popularity amongst the electorate and was ousted from the leadership by Kevin Rudd in June 2013. She resigned the next day. Although Gillard was on the wrong side of the same-sex marriage debate, history has been kind to her. She is now considered to the middle to upper tier of successful Australian Prime Ministers. But her crowning personal achievement, in my opinion, was ripping Tony Abbott a new one with her famous sexism and misogyny speech. She said later it stemmed from her frustration that sexism and misogyny could still be so bad in the 21st century and the toll of not pointing that out. These days, Julia Gillard has won international accolades for her advocacy for issues affecting women, mental health and education. We're over halfway through Women's History Month and it turns out we have no shortage of women to celebrate. Today for our arts segment, we're going to talk about one of the first people to talk about Australian culture in Australian writing, Miles Franklin. Born Stella Maria Sarah Miles Franklin on 14th of October 1879 near Tamat in New South Wales, Franklin wrote extensively about the challenges faced by Australian women in the early 20th century. At the age of 21, she published her autobiographical book, My Brilliant Career, in 1901 to great acclaim. The 1979 film of the book, starring Judy Davis and Sam Neill and directed by Gillian Armstrong, is now considered a classic. In 1906, Franklin went to New York and she worked with the National Women's Trade Union League. One of her jobs was editing a journal for women workers. In her articles, she united the literary with the industrial and with women's rights. Returning to Australia in 1932, Franklin became an advocate for Australian voices in writing and fellowship schemes that nurtured them. Her contributions to Australian literary history and appreciation culminated in lectures delivered at the University of Western Australia. Seeking to preserve her feminist and literary vision of Australia, she set up the annual Miles Franklin Award. It is still awarded today to a literary novel that presents Australian life in any of its phases. For our businesswoman of this week in Women's History Month, we have a woman you may not realise started out in Australia, Helena Rubenstein. She was responsible for the first global cosmetics empire, and it all started from a shop front in Melbourne. Born in Krakow in 1870, she ran away to Australia to escape an arranged marriage to a wealthy widower in 1894. Stylishly dressed, her milky complexion quickly became the envy of the local women, and she attributed it to a face cream she brought with her from Poland. Sensing a business opportunity, she sent back home for supplies to sell to local women in Australia. She quickly figured out that the higher you set the price, the more likely women are to buy. She set up a beauty salon in Melbourne with the help of 2 acquaintances she met on the ship out. She styled herself as a businesswoman of means, but in reality moonlighted as a governess and waitress. Thanks to her sheep farming uncle in central Victoria, she had access to a vast amount of lanolin and began making her own face creams. They cost 10 pence to make and she sold them for 6 shillings each. She embraced a quasi-scientific doctrine of beauty, allied with medical practices of consultation, prescription and treatment around her products that was long on marketing and short on actual evidence. She also worked out very quickly that in Australia, everything sounds better if you say it in French. Her empire grew with remarkable speed, and she began sending for her siblings to come and help her. By 1908, she left Australia for London with £100,000 to invest. Rubenstein had a great love for art and literature that influenced the way she furnished her salons. She soon began expanding into the United States, where she entered into an extraordinarily bitter feud with Florence Nightingale Graham of Elizabeth Arden and Charles Revson of Revlon. She never retired from business and became a generous philanthropist of the arts. Although she died in New York, she never forgot Australia for giving her a start, and one of her numerous portraits hangs in the National Gallery. For our science segment of Women's History Month this week, we're going to look at Dame Annie Jean Macnamara. A medical scientist and doctor, her research into the poliomyelitis virus directly contributed to the development of the vaccine. Polio is a highly infectious disease caused by a virus that invades the nervous system, usually of children under 5. If you're lucky, you won't notice any symptoms, despite being highly contagious. If you're not, it can cause temporary and permanent disability and sometimes total paralysis within a few hours. An exceptional student, Dr. Macnamara trained to be a doctor at the University of Melbourne, graduating in 1925. Wanting to work with children, she began to specialise in polio at the Royal Children's Hospital. Every summer, she would see an influx of children suffering from polio, and she began to develop methods of treatment. Her resulting research showed that there was more than one strain of polio virus circulating, and this was an early step in the development of the Salk vaccine. But her polio work put her into conflict with other specialists, so she decided to move into orthopaedics and focus on aftercare regimes for victims of polio, cerebral palsy, and other disabilities. This involved everything from splints, physiotherapy, and nutrition. Renowned for her blunt manner, she was beloved by children, and they would wait for hours just to see her. Also credited with bringing the idea of using myxomatosis on rabbits to Australia, and fought against the indiscriminate use of pesticides. Ironically, she was a chain smoker and died of heart disease in 1968. Thanks to the work of Dr. Macnamara and the polio vaccine, Australia has been polio-free since the year 2000. But sadly, there are still hundreds of thousands of people who live with the consequences of this horrible disease. To understand the experiences of Aboriginal women for Women's History Month, we look to the work of Bundjalung woman Ruby Langford Ginibi. Born in 1934 at Box Ridge Mission in New South Wales, Ruby was top of her class at school. But sadly her mother left the family and her father would not allow her to pursue further education because it required permission from the Aboriginal Protection Board. By 17 she became trapped in abusive relationships and spent many years struggling to make ends meet as she raised her children. Over time she built a career as a writer, Aboriginal historian, activist and lecturer. Then in 1988 she published the first of 5 autobiographies. Don't Take Your Love to Town, taking its name from the old Kenny Rogers song, covered 5 generations of familial bonds. Written in her trademark conversational style, the book proved the catalyst for Langford Ginibi to be recognised as one of Australia's premier storytellers of urban and rural Indigenous life during the last half-century. Her books put a public face on the discrimination, thwarted potential and disconnection from country faced by many Australian Aboriginal people, especially those growing up in urban environments. Many of the systemic societal problems she wrote about continue today: high Aboriginal incarceration rates, deaths in custody, ingrained social racism and an innate feeling of isolation. Although she died in 2011, Ruby Langford Ginibi's work continues to be extremely important in the effort to break the cycle of racial and social disadvantage for Aboriginal Australians. In 2021, Sydney Harbour Ferries named one of their ferries after her to honour her contribution to understanding Aboriginal culture in Australia. Today for sport in Women's History Month, we're going to look at the battle for women to play Australian rules football. Now, it might surprise you that women have been trying to play Australian rules football in a competitive way since before World War I. So how come it took so long for this to happen? Well, it's because men were not prepared to make space for women, and this included physical space. Men monopolised all sporting grounds and amenities on Saturdays, and most states did not allow playing organised sports on Sundays until well after World War II. But it included societal space too. Many men and women could not conceptualise the idea that women may relish the clashes needed to play a contact sport. Women who tried to play were often condemned by churches, mocked by their families, and laughed at by the media. It turns out that when they did get to play, most men didn't have a problem with it at all. It turns out that watching football is watching football no matter who is playing. Unfortunately, these were not the men in charge of Australian rules football. Times only began to change in 1980. This is when Gemma Griffiths, a teacher at Preston Technical College, tenaciously began putting together the Victorian Women's Football League. She struggled for years to get it off the ground. Meanwhile, over in Perth, a determined 22-year-old clerical assistant named Joanne Huggins had grown tired of umpiring her little brother's games. She wanted to play herself, and fortunately, her ambition came just as Australian rules football went nationwide. With the West Coast Eagles looming, its future CEO Brian Cook threw his support behind Huggins WA Women's League. A lack of funding inhibited the formation of a national league until 1998, when state-based teams began playing together for the first time. As the years passed, there are plenty of young girls playing football, but there was no national pathway for them. Then in 2017, the AFLW League began, and we have women like Gemma Griffiths and Joanne Huggins, plus the men that supported them, to thank for that.